The Earth was peaceful. It had been years since humanity had seen any major conflicts. Life had settled into a steady rhythm, and the world's nations worked together in harmony. But that calm would not last. One morning, the sky above Earth turned black. It wasn't a storm, nor was it something that could be explained by weather patterns. The entire planet watched as a fleet of enormous ships appeared in the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. No one knew where they had come from or what they wanted. But the aliens' intent was clear. They had come to conquer. In a matter of hours, the world was plunged into panic. Governments scrambled to respond. Military bases went on high alert. News stations broadcasted the same terrifying message. The invaders were unlike anything the human race had ever seen. They were vast, powerful, and their ships glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. The cities were silent, their inhabitants staring at the sky in fear and disbelief. People who had never imagined such an event could happen now had to face it head-on. The first alien strike was devastating. With a sudden burst of energy, their ships sent waves of destructive blasts across Earth's major cities. Buildings crumbled to dust, entire neighborhoods were obliterated, and panic spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the weapons that terrified humanity. It was the speed and precision with which the aliens attacked. They had no mercy. They didn't even bother to communicate. They simply destroyed. Within the first few hours, the world had already lost thousands of people. The governments of Earth were in disarray. The military, once thought to be prepared for any conflict, was crushed under the weight of the alien onslaught. Humanity's first attempts at retaliation were laughable. The best they could muster were missiles and fighter jets, but they were no match for the alien technology. The alien ships moved with a grace and speed that the human forces couldn't keep up with. The missiles fired by Earth's military exploded harmlessly against force fields. The fighter jets were swatted from the sky like flies, their pilots unable to even get close to their intended targets. The aliens had technology far beyond what humans had ever imagined, and it became quickly clear that humanity was no longer the dominant force on Earth. As the days went by, the alien forces began to establish control over key areas of the planet. The cities were abandoned, with only a few brave souls attempting to fight back. The alien fleet hovered above the Earth's surface, spreading their influence in waves. Their presence was suffocating. The world's leaders tried to negotiate, but the aliens didn't answer. The few humans who dared to speak to them were met with only silence, or worse, swift punishment. The invaders showed no interest in communicating. They were there to conquer, and they would not be deterred. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming power, something incredible began to happen. At first, it was only a small group of survivors, scattered across the planet. The survivors didn't have advanced technology or powerful weapons. They had nothing but what they could find in the rubble. They started to fight back using what they had. Simple tools, scrap metal, anything they could scavenge. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that something was more than the aliens had expected. The humans started to improvise. They weren't giving up without a fight. A group of soldiers, trapped in a destroyed city, managed to find weapons from the wreckage of a military convoy. They didn't have tanks, but they had enough explosives and makeshift guns to make their presence known. In the small towns and villages, farmers began to arm themselves with farming tools. The world's citizens, once terrified and hopeless, began to unite against their invaders. The aliens were confused. They had never encountered an enemy like this before. Most species they had conquered simply bowed down and submitted. But humanity was different. They didn't have the most powerful weapons. They didn't have the advanced technology of the aliens, but they had something far more dangerous: the will to fight for survival. Humanity was not going to bow down. But the aliens still laughed. How could humans, with their primitive tools and low-tech weapons, pose any threat to them? They were in control, and nothing would change that. The humans were a distraction, nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The aliens believed that as long as they maintained their superiority, They would crush humanity's resistance without breaking a sweat. Yet, the humans were not easily deterred. Each small victory against the invaders built their confidence. People who had once lived in fear now found themselves fighting for something much larger than themselves. They were fighting for Earth. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their future. And they would not stop, no matter how difficult the odds seemed. In the aftermath of each alien attack, survivors came together, sharing what they had learned, what worked, and what didn't. Slowly, the humans began to turn their once laughable efforts into something more organized. They started to form resistance groups, building on each other's strengths. They were using their surroundings, their environment, to create weapons out of everyday objects. Chairs were turned into shields, pipes into rifles. They used fire, they used sound, they used anything at their disposal to push the aliens back, even if only for a short while. And every time the humans managed to damage an alien ship or shoot down one of their crafts, the aliens were forced to rethink their position. They were no longer dealing with a species ready to surrender. They were dealing with a species that, despite everything, refused to die. The invaders had underestimated the resilience of humanity. They thought the humans would simply fold under pressure. But in reality, the more they pushed, the more humans fought back. The fight was far from over, and the aliens were starting to realize that this war was far from one-sided. The humans had begun to transform their world into a battleground. Every object, every piece of technology, every tool, they could turn them all into weapons. From farming tools to household items, nothing was too simple to be repurposed. What the aliens had dismissed as useless was becoming their worst nightmare. And though the invaders still believed victory was theirs to claim, humanity's unexpected resistance was starting to change the tide of the war. The humans had started the fight unprepared, but now they were becoming something the aliens had never anticipated, a force to be reckoned with. And the universe was about to learn just how dangerous humanity could be. The days passed, and the world had grown used to the constant hum of alien ships above. Cities lay in ruins. Most of humanity had been pushed into hiding, and Earth's once vibrant population was now scattered. Yet, in the midst of destruction, humanity's resilience sparked something incredible. People who had once lived ordinary lives were now adapting to survive. They began to transform their cities into makeshift battlegrounds, turning their former homes and workplaces into fortresses. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and they would fight for it. The first true act of resistance came from a group of survivors in the ruins of what was once Chicago. The aliens had bombed the city into near oblivion, leaving nothing but smoldering wreckage. Yet in the heart of the devastation, a small group of civilians, led by a former soldier named James, gathered what little they could. They found rifles, grenades, and a few old military vehicles. They didn't have tanks, jets, or any of the alien technology they had seen. But they had one thing the aliens hadn't expected: unity. James and his group of survivors moved quietly at night, attacking alien patrols and stealing technology from destroyed ships. They didn't have much, but they used what they could to their advantage. Even something as simple as a pile of scrap metal could be fashioned into a weapon with enough creativity. The aliens, at first, didn't even notice these small, unorganized attacks. They thought the humans were no more than an annoyance, nothing to worry about. But as the days passed, the aliens began to realize that their invincible air superiority was not so secure. A small resistance group in a remote part of the world managed to hack into one of the alien communication systems. The humans couldn't fully understand the alien language, but they learned enough to listen in on their plans. It was a breakthrough. The humans now had some knowledge of the enemy's movements. With each new piece of information, they planned their next attack carefully. They were beginning to understand that they didn't need to fight the aliens head-on. They just had to keep them off balance, keep them guessing. James and his group weren't alone in this effort. Across the globe, more and more small pockets of resistance began to form. In Europe, a group of farmers used their tractors and farm tools to fight back. They had no weapons, but they had the land. They used the terrain to create traps and ambushes. The aliens, thinking they had nothing to fear from a group of farmers, were caught off guard when their patrols were attacked by makeshift bombs and razor-sharp farm tools. In Asia, a group of engineers and students found a way to use the alien technology left behind in the wreckage. They reverse-engineered a basic version of the alien weaponry, and while it wasn't perfect, it was enough. Armed with their new weapons, they struck at the alien strongholds, weakening the invaders one blow at a time. The attacks were small, but they were becoming more coordinated. Every time the aliens sent out a patrol, they found themselves faced with traps, ambushes, and surprise attacks. And when one of the alien ships was taken down, the humans used it to their advantage. They would scavenge parts and try to understand how the alien technology worked. It wasn't always successful, but with each failure came valuable knowledge. One evening, James and his group of survivors managed to steal a small alien drone that had been sent to scout the area. They took it back to their hideout and began tearing it apart. It was slow work, but they learned things. They learned how the drones communicated with the motherships and how the alien forces were able to coordinate their attacks. That night, they used what they had learned to send a false signal to the aliens, sending them in the wrong direction. It was a small victory, but it showed that the tide of war could be turned, bit by bit. As the resistance grew, so did their tactics. They began to target alien supply lines, attacking the resources the invaders relied on to keep their war effort going. The humans had limited resources, but they were using them smartly. They knew that every blow to the alien supply chain would make them weaker. Every successful attack built the confidence of humanity's resistance forces. But it wasn't just about winning small battles. The humans were fighting for something greater. The memory of their fallen friends and families, the loss of their homes, and the desire to take back their world fueled their determination. It wasn't just survival. They were fighting to reclaim their future, to prove that no matter how powerful the invaders were, humanity would never stop fighting for the life they had lost. The aliens began to notice something strange. They couldn't understand how the humans, who had seemed so weak and helpless at first, were becoming more organized, more resourceful. It was clear that the humans were adapting, learning, and evolving in ways the aliens had never anticipated. They had underestimated the strength of humanity's will to survive. At the same time, the humans were learning more about their enemies. They began to study the alien ships and the technology they had left behind. Even with limited resources, they began to understand the inner workings of the alien fleet. It wasn't just a battle of strength anymore. It was a battle of wits, of survival instincts, and humans had always been resourceful. They had a unique ability to adapt to any situation. It was that very adaptability that would turn the tide of the war. As the days passed, James and his group were able to capture more and more alien technology. They made incredible strides, turning alien tech into their own tools of war. What had once been a hopeless situation was now a steady fight for survival. The invaders were beginning to realize that the humans were far more dangerous than they had first thought. They were not just facing a race of beings with no weapons or defenses. They were facing a species that would use every advantage, no matter how small, to win. In the midst of this growing resistance, one thing became clear: humanity would never back down. They had started this fight with nothing but their will to survive, and now they were becoming something far greater. The invaders had made a terrible mistake underestimating them. The war was far from over, but the humans had taken the first crucial steps toward victory. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. The tide of the war continued to shift. With every passing day, the resistance grew stronger, more organized, and more daring. What had once seemed like an impossible battle was now turning into a fight that the aliens could no longer ignore. Humanity's resourcefulness and determination were proving to be a force to be reckoned with, and the invaders were beginning to feel the sting of their underestimation. James and his group, now a well-coordinated team of survivors, had become something of a legend among the resistance. They had managed to steal advanced alien technology, reverse engineer it, and use it to fight back. The alien ships, once invincible, were now vulnerable. Every time an enemy ship was downed, the humans would scavenge parts, analyze them, and use whatever they could find to improve their own weapons. They were no longer just stealing scraps. They were turning those scraps into weapons of war. One evening, as James and his group scouted a nearby alien supply depot, they stumbled upon something that could change the course of the war. The aliens had stored large amounts of energy cells and weapons in a heavily guarded compound. They knew that if they could take control of this supply, it would be a massive blow to the invaders. But taking the depot would not be easy. The compound was protected by the most advanced alien defense systems they had encountered yet. As they planned their attack, James knew that they had to be strategic. It wasn't enough to just throw everything they had at the compound. They needed to outthink the aliens, not outgun them. The humans had learned this lesson the hard way. They couldn't match the alien ships in raw power, but they could use their knowledge of the environment, their creativity, and their adaptability to outmaneuver them. The group split into two teams, one to disable the defense systems and the other to breach the compound. As they approached the facility under the cover of darkness, they could see the bright, almost blinding lights of the alien ships overhead. The tension was thick in the air as James and his team silently moved through the shadows, avoiding detection at all costs. When they reached the security station, the team leader, a woman named Sarah, used one of the alien communication devices they had stolen to hack into the system. They had learned enough about the alien technology to disable their security networks, but it was never easy. Every step was a calculated risk. If they triggered an alarm, they would be swarmed by the enemy within seconds. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah worked quickly, her fingers flying over the alien console. Finally, with a sharp click, the security systems went down. The way was clear. The second team moved in, using the moment of surprise to launch their attack. They didn't have advanced weapons, but they had something the aliens couldn't anticipate: guerrilla tactics. They set off explosive charges in strategic locations, creating chaos and confusion among the invaders. The aliens were used to straightforward assaults, but this was different. The humans didn't fight with brute force. They fought with strategy, trickery, and quick thinking. The humans had learned from every failed attempt and had used that knowledge to improve their tactics. They knew how to fight dirty. When the aliens sent reinforcements, the humans used the very terrain they had once thought of as a disadvantage. They set traps, using everything from abandoned cars to rocks to confuse and disorient the invaders. For the first time, the aliens felt something they hadn't felt before: fear. The battle at the supply depot was intense. The humans fought with everything they had, throwing themselves into the fray without hesitation. James and Sarah moved through the compound, taking down alien guards and securing the energy cells and weapons. They knew that if they could get this equipment back to their main base, it would turn the tide of the war. As the battle raged on, the aliens began to realize something they hadn't accounted for. The humans, though seemingly outmatched, were relentless. They didn't just fight for survival. They fought for their world, for their future. And that determination made them dangerous in ways the aliens hadn't understood. By the time the last alien soldier had been driven off, the humans had secured the depot. But they didn't celebrate. There was no time for that. The victory was important, but it was just one small step in a much larger war. They had learned another lesson that night, that the invaders were not invincible, and that humanity could, in fact. The success of this mission rippled throughout the global resistance. News of the humans' victory spread quickly, and it inspired more people to join the fight. Where there had once been fear, now there was hope. The human race had proven that it was not willing to just lie down and be conquered. They were capable of much more than anyone had ever given them credit for. But even with this newfound confidence, the war was far from over. The aliens had learned to take humanity more seriously, and they would not back down easily. They would regroup, adapt, and come at the humans with more force. But the humans had made a statement. They had shown the aliens that, despite the odds, they would never stop fighting. James and his team knew that the real battle was just beginning. They had only just scratched the surface of what the aliens could do, and they still had a long way to go before they could take back Earth. But there was no turning back now. Humanity had discovered its strength, and it was a force that would not be extinguished. With their victory at the supply depot, the humans had gained momentum, but they knew that the next phase of the war would be even more difficult. The aliens had only just begun to respond to humanity's defiance. But one thing was certain: humanity was not going to lose. Not this time. The war was far from over. Despite their victory at the supply depot, the resistance knew they were just scratching the surface of the alien threat. The aliens were relentless, and they had vast resources at their disposal. Yet, with every victory the humans gained, their determination only grew. The small skirmishes were now turning into larger battles, and the once hopeless humanity was now holding their ground, showing the invaders that Earth was far from an easy target. James and his group were no strangers to these new challenges. After securing the supply depot, they quickly mobilized to put their newly acquired energy cells and alien weapons to use. The next major target was the alien communication network. They had learned from their earlier successes that disrupting the invaders' coordination was key to their survival. If they could disable the aliens' ability to communicate across their forces, it would be a massive blow. But it wasn't going to be easy. The aliens were adapting. They had started to make their defenses more sophisticated, and their forces were now patrolling in more heavily fortified areas. The humans had seen these changes, and they knew they would have to get creative if they were going to make any headway. The plan James and Sarah came up with was risky, but it was the only option they had. They would infiltrate an alien base on the outskirts of what was once New York City, where the main communication hub was located. The base was surrounded by high-tech barriers and patrolled by hundreds of alien soldiers. It would be a near impossible task, but the humans had already proven that they could defy the odds. James, Sarah, and their teams spent days preparing. They used their knowledge of alien technology to bypass the security systems, and they scavenged whatever they could find to create new, unconventional weapons. The humans knew the aliens would never expect them to use the very tools they once saw as mundane: old vehicles, scrap metal, and everyday items that they had transformed into deadly weapons. On the night of the mission, they moved swiftly through the darkened streets. The faint glow of alien ships hovered overhead, but the humans were accustomed to working in the shadows. They knew how to stay out of sight, how to avoid detection. The element of surprise had worked in their favor so far, and they were going to make sure it continued. The alien base was heavily guarded, but the humans were determined. They used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, setting up distractions and traps for the alien patrols. It wasn't long before their presence was detected, and the aliens began to tighten their security. But the humans were already inside the base, and they knew they didn't have much time. As they approached the communication hub, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a gut instinct he had developed over the years of being a soldier. He motioned for his team to halt. They waited in silence, their breath steady, their eyes scanning every corner. The tension was palpable. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them shook. The sound of alien alarms blared in the distance, signaling that their presence had been discovered. It was a race against time now. James and his team rushed forward, their weapons ready, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had no choice but to go in hard and fast. As they reached the communication hub, they were met with fierce resistance. Alien soldiers, heavily armored and armed with devastating energy weapons, poured in from every direction. The humans fought back with everything they had. The once simple tools they had repurposed: battering rams, improvised explosives, even pieces of alien technology, were now deadly weapons in their hands. They had learned to fight in a way the aliens couldn't predict, using every object at their disposal to turn the tide. James and Sarah fought side by side, taking down enemy after enemy. They didn't have the power of the aliens' advanced weapons, but they had something much more powerful: the will to survive. Every strike, every ambush, every act of defiance pushed them forward. In the chaos of battle, the humans made their way to the central communication terminal. It was a massive, intricate device that pulsed with alien energy. James knew that this was the heart of the enemy's ability to coordinate their attacks. If they could destroy it, it would cripple the aliens' operations across the planet. But the terminal was heavily protected. Alien drones hovered above, and alien soldiers guarded it fiercely. The humans were outnumbered, but they didn't hesitate. They attacked with everything they had, using every scrap of weaponry and technology they had gathered over the months. It was a fight for survival, and they knew they had to give everything to win. James could feel the tension in his body, the weight of each decision pressing on him. Every second that passed made it harder to keep fighting, but they couldn't stop. They had come too far. They had already proven the aliens wrong, and they couldn't let them reclaim their control. Finally, after what felt like hours, they managed to breach the terminal's defenses. With a loud explosion, the communications hub erupted into a ball of fire, sending a shockwave through the base. The alien forces scrambled in confusion. Their coordinated attacks faltered as their communication systems went dark. The humans had done it. They had crippled the invaders' ability to function as a unified force. The victory, however, was bittersweet. As the humans made their escape from the base, they knew that the war was far from over. The aliens would retaliate, and they would not take this blow lightly. But the message had been sent. Humanity was not just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to win. And the aliens would have to learn that lesson the hard way. In the days that followed, the resistance movements across the globe began to organize with renewed vigor. The destruction of the communication hub had given them a glimpse of what they were capable of. They had proven that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, they could stand tall, fight back, and emerge victorious. But as James stood among his fellow survivors, watching the sunrise over the ruined world they had once known, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The aliens were regrouping, and the next phase of the war would be even more brutal than before. But no matter what came next, James knew one thing for certain: humanity would not back down. They had already shown that they could turn everything into a weapon, and they would use every advantage they had to win. The war was far from over, but humanity's resolve had never been stronger. The aliens had underestimated them once, but they would not make that mistake again. The following weeks after the destruction of the communication hub marked a turning point in the war. The aliens had been dealt a significant blow, but they were far from defeated. Humanity, however, was no longer the desperate underdog. The victory had sparked something deeper within the resistance: unity, hope, and a fierce determination to drive the invaders off their planet for good. James and Sarah found themselves at the forefront of this new phase of the war, working tirelessly to organize the scattered resistance groups across the globe. The message was clear: humanity would fight back, and no matter how advanced the aliens were, they would never underestimate the power of human ingenuity and spirit again. The next target was the aliens' main supply lines, the very lifeblood that kept their forces in power. James knew that to truly cripple the invaders, they needed to cut off their resources: energy, food, ammunition. Without it, the aliens would be forced to retreat. But the supply depots were heavily guarded, situated in some of the most inaccessible regions on Earth. To get to them, they would need to rely on more than just their firepower. They would need to rely on their adaptability. In the planning rooms, maps of the alien strongholds were laid out, and the strategy was discussed in hushed tones. The human forces were not large enough to take the depots head-on. They would have to use their advantage of surprise and their ability to adapt, taking on guerrilla tactics that the aliens had never anticipated. They would strike fast, hard, and then disappear into the shadows, just as they had done before. The operation was to take place in the heart of the alien-controlled territories. James had no illusions about the risks. They would be walking right into the belly of the beast. But as he stood before his team, he saw the resolve in their eyes. They had come this far, and they would not stop now. As night fell, the group prepared to move out. This time, they had an even greater advantage: the knowledge they had gained over the past months. They knew how to infiltrate alien bases, disable security systems, and use alien technology against them. And most importantly, they knew the terrain. The cities had become ruins, but they were still their home. The broken streets, the abandoned buildings, the scattered remnants of their once great civilization. They knew how to use all of it. The first strike came without warning. James, Sarah, and their team infiltrated an alien depot located just outside what had once been Chicago. Using the cover of night, they slipped past the perimeter defenses, avoiding detection with the precision of trained soldiers. The aliens, once so sure of their superiority, now found themselves on the defensive. The humans planted explosives at key points in the depot, targeting the storage of critical resources. The moment the charges went off, the explosion was deafening. Fire and smoke billowed into the night sky as the depot erupted in flames. The alien forces scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The humans had already melted back into the darkness, leaving behind chaos in their wake. The impact of this attack was felt immediately. Alien forces began to retreat, scrambling to contain the damage. The resistance was emboldened. Word spread quickly, and more civilians joined the fight. Humanity was no longer just a small, disorganized group of rebels. They were a global movement. The invaders were starting to realize that their hold on Earth was not as unshakable as they had believed. But the aliens would not give up without a fight. They retaliated swiftly, launching coordinated strikes against human strongholds across the planet. James and his team were ready. They had anticipated this move, and their defense strategies were already in place. The war had entered a new phase, one of constant motion, where victory and defeat were measured not just by the number of battles won, but by the ability to outlast and outsmart the enemy. One of the most critical moments came when the aliens began to target civilian populations directly. They had realized that by terrorizing the people, they could break their spirits. Entire cities were bombarded with devastating energy weapons, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins in their wake. The alien forces had learned to be more ruthless, and their tactics had become even more brutal. But humanity would not be broken. The resistance adapted again, shifting tactics to focus on defense and counterattacks. They had to protect their homes, their families, and their future. James, Sarah, and the other leaders of the human resistance knew that if they didn't fight back now, the aliens would soon control everything. In the midst of this chaos, a breakthrough came. A team of scientists, working with the stolen alien technology, managed to reverse engineer a new type of weapon, a weapon capable of neutralizing the alien energy shields. It was a game changer. With this new weapon, humanity could finally go on the offensive, striking directly at the heart of the alien forces. The resistance quickly mobilized, launching their first full-scale assault with the new weapon. The aliens, though caught off guard by the sudden shift in tactics, fought back with everything they had. The battle was fierce, and casualties were high on both sides. But humanity was no longer fighting with desperation. They were fighting with the knowledge that they could win. In a final, decisive battle, the humans launched their assault on the alien mothership. It had been hovering over the planet, overseeing the destruction of Earth from above. The aliens had assumed that their control over the skies would give them the upper hand, but they had underestimated humanity's resolve. The humans fought their way through the alien defenses, using everything at their disposal. Their energy weapons, their traps, their makeshift bombs, they were all part of the final push. James and Sarah led the charge, fighting side by side as they made their way to the heart of the mothership. The alien forces were fierce, but they were faltering. With the new weapon and the element of surprise, the humans were overwhelming them. The final blow came when James managed to plant the explosive device at the core of the mothership's energy core. With a deafening explosion, the alien vessel was destroyed, and the remaining invaders scattered in disarray. The victory was bittersweet. The planet was scared, and humanity had paid a heavy price, but they had won. The aliens, once so sure of their dominance, had been driven off Earth. Humanity had proven that they were not just survivors. They were warriors, capable of turning anything into a weapon when the fight was for their survival. As James stood among the wreckage, looking at the horizon where the first light of dawn was breaking through, he knew that the war was over. The invaders had learned a painful lesson. Never underestimate humanity. The planet, though devastated, would rebuild. The fight had been long, but humanity had emerged victorious, stronger than ever before. And as the world began to heal, the message was clear: Earth would never again be an easy target.